Hey and welcome back to another process walkthrough video. So we're now looking at the third piece of the recent set, and here it is. So I really like this piece. I'm not gonna lie, I really enjoy painting this one, and I'm so glad to have finished it. It feels like one of those things that you really not are not sure whether you have the skill to do. So it feels really good that I managed to sort of put something together that looks reasonable. So without further ado, let's begin the process breakdown. So to begin the scene, right, I set up something really simple here. But you might be wondering, like, hey, actually, this looks kind of sharp. What magic trick did you use? All I used was my trusty old perspective tools V2. Let me expand it a little bit. My goodness, yeah. All I used was my very trusty perspective tools 2, and I made a simple grid. I made a really rough sketch, and I applied the grid, and I was a little bit faint. And then the next thing I did was to draw 5 window panels, type in the font. For those who don't recognize the characters, it kind of means like information agency. So this is kind of like the character's hideout, sort of like a cover front, or it could be an old building that they took over, like an old office that they took over as a home. Because of the vibe of the city is one that's really chaotic. Like, this is something that's actually possible and in universe, so that is kind of the idea behind this particular scene. So in terms of distributing the values, once again, right, clearly it's a night scene, as with before. I wanted to keep the integrity of the scene and make sure that it's dark. So the foreground is pretty dark, and then we have the sort of background in a really small sliver over here. We have the background here in a really tiny sliver, right? But it's important to have same with the area here, and then we have the interior, right, which is here. So I typed out this, drew 5 windows, typed out the font, and then transformed it into this area here. And what that does is to give me a pretty great anchor for the scene, right? Because this is such a big element, it's a really big element of the scene. And if I'm able to transform this element that's conveniently very rectangular, conveniently very regular shape, and has a bit of a repeating pattern, if I'm able to fit that into the scene in the very central position and essentially keep it there as an anchor, it's really helpful in making the scene look more cohesive, right? Even if it's a placeholder, even if I might make small changes to it, having something sharp and well defined can be a very good way to sort of anchor your post or anchor your draft down. And it's not always applicable, especially when drawing characters, right? It's hard to be like, okay, so let me just make something that's already perfectly sharp and it's going to stay 99% the way it is. But when drawing environments, things like this can be really helpful. So that's kind of the first lesson that I've learned here as well for myself. And next, I kind of want to separate the interior and exterior. So the interior is a little bit brighter, while outside here we have like this sort of dark metal floorboard or flooring, grills type of thing. Inside we have a wooden floor that's picking up light from the foyer of the house, right? The entryway of the house, the apartment, whatever you want to call it. And then we have a bit of a couch here, something like that. I actually made a floor plan for this. I would like to show you guys it a little bit later. But let's, talk about this particular drawing first. So this is the sketch, capturing the overall dark, setting. It's at night, and then we have a bit of light here in the interior because that's a big part of the whole point of this scene, is to sort of showcase a little bit of the interior, showcase the character's hideout with some context clues, and in higher detail, right? But still maintain a readable composition, right? This isn't concept art, although concept art can also be compositionally more sound, but it's not the priority of concept art, right? Here we're doing illustration, we want to make sure things look as pretty as we can get it. So moving on to the next stage, right? Here's where I started to go a bit messy. I started to figure out some colors. For example, I wanted the area inside to be warm, so this was my initial plan. The outside area needed to be, of course, cooler to sort of separate it out from the interior. So we have this sort of bluish thing going on. The reds I introduced later on to have a different local color introduced to the scene to avoid, the monochromatic feel, right? As I mentioned before, things can easily look a lot very monochromatic if you all have things that are on the same side of the value range and they're stuck to it, and then that's not usually how things exist, right? Especially in our context here, where we're drawing someone's, very almost ramshackle hideout. It's not like a pristine, techno aesthetic, right? It's not run down in a way, but it's kind of, all over the place. So it's kind of messy, it's kind of homey as well, very cozy. So having a wide spread of colors, or having at least some spread of colors, is going to be important to make sure it doesn't become too sterile, right? It's not like a factory floor that's really, really sterile. We have like clay pots, we have like this type of reddish clay pots, brownish clay pots, and all these things add a bit of color to this outside area that has a lot of steel, has a lot of metal structures, stuff like that. And so this is the layout of the color situation. Also some red and green highlights here just to indicate that this is the background, right? It can be hard because far away things are kind of grayish as well. It might kind of blend in with the kind of catwalk outside the apartment. So I had this particular little highlight here to make sure to remind myself that actually this is a good way we can separate things out. Then next is where we start tuning the values and getting them in place. So this is the hardest part for me personally, because it's a bit difficult to know exactly how you want to set things up, right? Do we want a top-down lighting, for example, a top-down lighting like such? Do we cast a shadow here because the foyer, or not foyer, but rather the overhang kind of ends here? The overhang kind of ends here, right? Do we have a shadow here? Is that a good way to do things? And then I struggled a bit in this particular area, and then I really thought about lighting, how the lighting actually works, right? How would the lighting look like in a real place if this place was real? And so I actually consulted one of my older pieces. If anyone remembers Bad Guys number 3, is that number? Yeah, I think it's Bad Guys 3, right? Where there's a character standing in front of like a tall building entryway, right? And there's a staircase in the background, and then there's a light coming in from one side. So that was the idea that I kind of looked at and said, oh, actually, that's a pretty good way to show, to display strong lighting on a dark, rainy night without committing to other light sources. So I decided, okay, so we have the light coming in from the side, right? Not from the top, because that will kind of confuse people, right? It's like, is this daylight? That's kind of weird. And then if we want it to be like a strong light, let's say from a huge signboard, right? That's going to be really, really strong. It's going to make this area super bright. And then that's going to conflict with this area here, right? Because I want this area to have I want it to have a nice contrast between here being the bright one and then here being the dark area. So I want that contrast. So what happens if I introduce a strong light just to illuminate, for example, from all above, this area is going to be really bright, and then we're going to break the contrast relationship, and that's not going to work. So I thought, okay, so we can balance the composition this way with a very nice interior detail, very warm, very cozy elements here. Then we have the colder side, right? Outside the building is cold, rainy, cold, stormy. All the raindrops are hitting the ground, or it's such a cold night. And then we have the aforementioned side lighting here to both show to kind of imply lightning almost in a way, but mainly to kind of describe the scene without having it become too dark, right? I just don't want it to be completely dark and then we have a warm light, right? We're gonna have a warm light on one side and then we have a cool light on the other. So that was the balance that I managed to strike. So as you can see here, I further developed the idea. As you can see the cast shadows here, right? The cast shadows here from this plant pot, right? Small things like this can really lock it in. But the thing, or rather lock it in for your viewers. So the viewer sees this is a visual, one of the visual cues. They're like, hey, it's pretty obvious that the light is coming from the right side. The cast shadow confirms it. And then that's all you need. That's all you need. That's the information conveyed. Mission success. You've conveyed to your viewers that there's a grayish but fairly strong light, almost like a lightning strike, for example, off in the distance, that is illuminating this area here, right? Here's almost the less interesting part, even though a lot of the focus, let's say when you first look at a drawing, right, it's gonna be here. You're gonna look at this area here, right? Most of our attention is gonna be here, right? Then your eye is gonna drift slowly across the frame here. But, you know, this area is a bit simpler, but I will talk about it a bit later. But here, I think is really, a part of the drawing that gave me the most trouble, but I'm really glad to have figured it out. So at this stage, the lighting is pretty much done. I like how the things are forming up, unlike how things are going. So it's pretty much time to start sharpening things up, right? Time to start painting things for real. I've already done a bit of painting for this area at this point in time. It's still very rough, unfortunately. You know, look at all these horrible brush strokes here. But I've captured a lot of the colors. All the colors are in, a lot of the different shadows are in. I'm pretty happy with it. And I wanted to continue painting things as they were, right? Essentially, I'm on a one-track path. I'm going to keep going. So for this next step, as you can see here, what I started adding was these patterns. Remember our perspective grid here? Oh, yeah, I kept it along all the time. So I basically just draw a grid of crisscrosses, threw them onto the ground using this perspective grid. Created a nice texture telling everyone exactly what this material is, right? This is that type of very it's like a anti-slip metal floor. I think that's the right term to describe it. It's just kind of like anti-slip metal floor. Like it's made out of panels on the ground with like drainage systems, and this is kind of like a outer catwalk, outer balcony area for this particular residence. And I think this is also really important because a lot of times when we're drawing bigger scenes, we tend to brush over these small things. And of course, this is up to your visual style, right? If you really just don't like drawing this kind of things, it's totally fine. But for me, right, in this particular context, I wanted to be sure to show everyone as much detail as I can, because I'm going to this length to try and describe the scene accurately. Might as well put an extra mile and make sure this thing is in place as well. And similar with the drainage grids here, once again, perspective grid, absolute savior as well, making sure that this thing is also basically I just draw a small segment, duplicate, and then lay it down according to the perspective grid, and it's all gonna be fine. Pretty simple stuff, honestly, for the most part here, which really goes to show the power of the perspective grid. Especially if you set it up correctly, right? It's gonna help you a lot when you're trying to work in these little details. And these little details are things that also help you anchor the drawing as well, right? Remember the very first anchor that we used, right? This very basic 5 pieces of glass with the letterings. It's really simple, but it's anchored us for so long. So as we continue painting, adding detail to a scene, repeating patterns are amazing for indicating perspective. Once again, patterns are amazing for indicating perspective. Because when we draw organic shapes, of course it's possible to follow the perspective, but the patterns are what really forces the perspective, right? So if all of them are lined up correctly, it's going to create a really, really strong impression of the perspective that is going on. And I think that is something that I've learned from this piece. So make sure you have your patterns ongoing. For example, the railing here as well, right? Just having all these lines spread out evenly in a pattern and then having them conform to the perspective lines, right? I know it's a bit hard to see, but the blue perspective lines are sort of the vertical ones. I had them conform to the vertical ones, transform them, control. For example, selected some, imagine these were the railings, distort, and then basically did this to them, and then that's what we got. Really, really simple stuff, right? This kind of looks, oh my goodness, it's so tedious. How do you manage to draw each of this so accurately? Just draw one, duplicate, make sure you keep an even distance, duplicate, transform, and you've got it. Of course, as you can continue painting on them, continue adding lighting, continue adding details, but to get a basic structure, which is sometimes the hardest part, it's really simple. Just make sure you use patterns, and then follow the perspective, and voila, you're pretty much done. And speaking of painting detail, interiors also started to receive a bit of an overhaul. For example, the floorboards here, Um, initially, initially I had a different version. Initially I drew floorboards like this, right? I'm gonna be a little bit rough. So initially the floorboards were like this. And then I was like, okay, so these are the floorboards. Initially it was in this pattern. Then I realized, wait, this looks really weird. Why would planks be in this shape? Yeah, and then I realized I was really dumb. And so in reality, if one of these sort of patterns, pay attention to real life examples. Simply search wood floor. One of them is going to be the pattern that you want or you remember. And this is a common pattern really, right? And so I chose this one because I felt like it was no reason actually. I think it's just one of the places that I lived in as a small kid. We had this type of wooden floor and it just stuck in my memory, right? It feels like someplace like home. So yeah, this type of wooden floor, really nice. Adds a bit of complexity to it as well, so you don't have like a flat grid, where and not everything is in a flat squarish grid. You have a lot of variation, a lot of angles, but because it's a pattern and it's also transformed to a perspective grid, it's gonna be really good for, you know, just showcasing the floor. And then with some simpler planks here, a bit of variation, some more straightforward planks in front. And then for the area here, you know, I started working on it, looking on the values, started cleaning things up. I drew this concurrently as the next frame that we're about to go to, in the next video, that is. So I drew this concurrently, so I was able to kind of refer back and forth, you know, what items are where, and how to lay out this, you know, entryway area, foyer area, for the hideout. So yeah, and I threw in a guitar here. Sharp eye viewers will know that this is just a photo reference, or rather a stock photo of a guitar, with me painting in a bit of perspective and stuffing it in. Reason being that because we're going to actually use a secret technique called hiding a lot of stuff in the areas that you don't want to draw. And here we go, right? In the final frame, I actually added these blinds. And I really actually like how these blinds are because they kind of contain the scene, right? Because here is kind of a very wide scene. There's a lot of things to look at. A lot of things to look at. And that's good, right? That's great. But sometimes it's just a little bit too much. And it feels like things are a bit too much off balance, right? Because if I drew things here as well, like for example, I drew in like shelves, it just feels like a little bit too dead and too inorganic, right? It feels a bit weird. And then drawing too much detail, you know, not quite feeling it. So I decided, hey, what if we use blinds, right? People use blinds in their homes. Pretty reasonable. And yeah, I got the idea and here we are. So instead of having the blinds all being one length, what I decided to do was have this sort of cascading effect. So that we have a nice triangular shape of orange, you know, which is still peeking out from behind the blinds. And then once again, layering the things for depth. And then we, of course, continue painting this area here, you know, the tiny little floor tiles that I, once again, right, painted this grid, threw it in, matched the perspective, and we're done. Yeah, just painting everything a little bit more detailed, even though the resolution is kind of low, but it's fine, right? Because this is sort of one aspect of things, and I just want it to be present and in good shape. And here we have sort of, you know, the power, the circuit breaker, and then we have like a couple of photo frames on the wall, a couple of shelves, and then like this sort of old school desk lamp that I thought was really cool. I love that jade green color on the desk lamp, right? And I just wanted to throw it in the scene. Some gold accents like a printer or fax machine, slippers, houseplant, all of these things, right? This area here is carried over from the next frame, so it's kind of like connected. Another thing that I'm really happy with. And so because we obscured, you know, this entire area here, right, it's really actually nice to help the viewer's eyes go in between these two now, right? It goes from here to here. It doesn't get distracted here. It still has enough density and noise to kind of, you know, feel like it's part of the picture. It doesn't feel out of place, right? But it's a quieter area of the drawing. It also allows us to show off the lighting on the lettering, right? The lettering is red, and here, because it's silhouetted, it's harder to see. But here it kind of stands out on its own. And yeah, and then we have a bit of lighting here as well. Basically, by this point, I'm painting things in more finely and then adding the rain effect. Of course, as always, right, please feel free to ask me additional questions in the comments, and I'll try my best to answer them. So for the outside, remember when I said, we don't want things to be too monochrome, right? Things like rusty railings, amazing. Right? When you're drawing a lot of metal surfaces, add some rust, especially if they are like non-sterile, as long as it's not like a sterile lab or anything, or maybe if it is, right? Feel free to add a bit of rust. Right? It's a nice reddish brown color that just completely breaks up the monotone gray. Even though you can add just a little bit of it and it'll do its job just fine. And yeah, so for painting the raindrops, right, this could be the hardest part. Just paint circles, but don't make it complete, right? Here you can see me making a bit of a mistake, right? This circle is complete and rather it hasn't been, right? Because you don't want it to tell the viewer that this is like it's not a plastic ring, right? It's like a ring of water. And because it's a ring, each part of the ring is at a different angle. And what that means is each part is going to reflect a different amount of light back at you. So you want to make sure that lines up, right? You want the viewer to see a different amount of light reflecting from each part of the ring. So we don't have to like go in and be like, okay, so this is going to reflect 10%, this is going to 25%, this is going to 40%. Just by breaking up the rings, right, it implies that it's not reflecting light, so it's only showing its transparent property. Maybe you can have a little bit of shadow if you want, right? A little bit of shadow if you want. So for example here, this one's a bit too bright, so something like this would be better. But in general, we just want to know that this is like little ripples of water, because the rain is so heavy that water is starting to pool on this area, and then you have like these very heavy ripples. And yeah, so drawing in some ripples here as well, on the railing as well. So it's super nice to draw them near highlights, because highlights are areas where otherwise you are the places where eye gravitates to, right? So if you want to tell the viewer, okay, there's heavy rain, it's hitting the railings, right? Do you draw it here? Maybe, but you can draw it here for sure, but you also must draw it here, because it's going to be weird otherwise, right? If the highlighted area is just super dry, you're just missing out an opportunity to show the viewers exactly what's going on in the scene. So having a raindrop strike here, just conveniently beside the highlighted area from the light within. Same here. Same here. Same here. We can essentially tell the viewer, hey, it's raining really hard. There's water spilling everywhere. There's raindrops everywhere. But it's really nice and cozy inside. And so yeah, that's the impression I wanted to convey. Similarly with highlights, it's also simpler than what you might think, right? Because we have a scene here where, the implication is that a lot of these surfaces are uneven, and it's raining heavily. There's a sense of randomness to things. You don't have to be super strict about things. What's important to remember is that highlights are always small, right? Most of the time, highlights are like pinpricks of light, just because this particular drop of water hit the right angles, reflecting a large amount of light at you. And yeah, just little dots here and there makes a rainy scene, a wet scene, really, really realistic. So yeah, that's it for this particular piece. And once again, feel free to ask me about the process, about the result, what I was going for, any questions you might have. I'll be happy to answer them. And so yeah, see you in the next video.